Hey folks, welcome to Bad GM's Campaign Build-Along. I'm the Bad GM Wayne Davis, and this is the podcast where we build an entire campaign for you from scratch that you can run for your group. It's a new season, and we're building for a new system. Well, a new system to me anyway. This season we're building a campaign for the Fallout Roleplaying Game. Fallout is published by Modifius Entertainment, and you can buy the book at your local game shop or online at modifius.net. I'd also note that this is a game that has special dice for it, so check out your local game shop for them or buy them online when you get your book, which, by the way, you can get in either hardcover or PDF form at the website. And if you're one of those that doesn't like buying game-specific dice, don't worry. I'll provide details on how to make it work with the dice you've already got. Okay, if you were with us from the beginning of last season, you know we spend the first few episodes going over the basics of the rules of the game, lay out our starting campaign location, and building characters. And this season will not be any different. It means this week's episode will be us going over the basics of the rules. And before I get into that, I do want to mention, I realize those of you that were listening to us last session, you realize this episode sounds a little bit different than the others. We're doing a little remodeling, setting up a new studio here at the worldwide headquarters. So for this week and next week, sound's going to probably be a little off. But in 3 weeks-ish, 2 weeks-ish, we'll have the new studio up and running, and things are not only going to be back to our normal sound quality, but I can assure you they're going to be better. Just a little bit of patience, and it will be rewarded. Okay. I'm digressing. Let's get into this. As I go through the episode today, I will be pointing out page numbers from the book, so if you've got a book, follow along. If you don't have a book yet, when you get one, replay this episode and follow along. Now, the Fallout role-playing game is based on the hugely popular video game series Fallout and draws its background and history from the game series. Now, I've been told by most of my players that it's mostly based on Fallout 3 and 4, but there do seem to be some rules that come from the other two games, plus the Vegas game that they did as well. For those who haven't played the video games, and up until I decided to run this game, I hadn't played it either. The basics of the background history go like this. Fallout uses an alternate history for the United States after 1945. It's set in a very 1950s retro futuristic style in architecture, fashion, furnishings, and sci-fi style. Needless to say, the history we know about the United States is all washed away, so we can't refer back to that as we go along. The tech of the country is based on a combination of vacuum tubes and nuclear fission, so things look a lot different than what we're accustomed to. And for the most part, I'm not going to get into that. What we need to be aware of is that around 1977, China and the United States started getting really aggressive towards each other, with China taking several countries for themselves, then taking Alaska. There were also various biological wars, with crops taking the hit and both countries suffering for it. Needless to say, what was a Cold War became a warm war, which led to the logical conclusion. On October 23, 2077, the morning was shattered by full-on nuclear war, which devastated the entire planet. From our various classes in high school and college over the years, we're very well aware of the damages nuclear weapons can cause, so I'm not going to expand on that here. Needless to say, a large portion of the population worldwide died in the initial blasts. Those that didn't die wound up being mutated in some ways, and we'll get into some of that a little later on. However, there were some who'd been fortunate enough to be moved to protective bunkers just before the bombs dropped, and they stayed there for varying amounts of time. They weren't contaminated with radiation, and they eventually emerged from the vaults, as they're called, to try to repopulate the Earth. Of course, there are horror stories about some of the bunkers, and we'll examine some of those as we build our campaign. The finances of Fallout are a little bit different than what we're used to seeing. With the fall of governments, traditional currencies just don't work. That doesn't mean they don't exist. Your group might find pre-war currencies as they search for items they need. That currency is essentially useless, and if you understand currency, you know why. For those of you who might not understand, let's give you a quick primer on currency. The only reason currency works is that it's backed by a valuable metal, typically either silver or gold, and backed by the government issuing the currency. That's the way it works in the US at present, as well as the UK with the pound sterling. The euro is basically backed with the faith of the European Union, so the philosophy is the same. Therefore, with no government to provide precious metals to back a currency with, there's no currency. And there aren't any banks remaining anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So the currency system in Fallout is basically a barter system. Again, we're all familiar with the barter system, so we don't need to expand on that here. Bottle caps are also a valuable trade currency, specifically Nuka-Cola caps. There's a long story there, but basically Nuka-Cola was more popular than both Coke and Pepsi are in our world today, so the caps from the bottles have value in the game. And don't worry about actually creating the caps for your game unless that's your style. If it's not, and it certainly isn't mine, you can get cardboard caps in the GM's Toolkit, which is also available at your local game shop or from the Modifius website. It's a big cardboard sheet of caps you can punch out and use for your game. Now, there are some other options if you want some caps. You can buy actual Nuka-Cola caps online. The Modifius website sells them. There are other sites that sell them that I typically would not even mention here. Amazon. And there are also folks on Etsy who make caps. It just depends on how many caps you're getting for how much money and how you want to do it. If you don't even want to go that far, just go online and look for like bottling supplies for like bottling your own beer, bottling your own soda, and just get a bag of red bottle caps. My buddy Jim was telling me about it where you could get like 1,000 of them for like 15, 20 bucks. Of course, I'd already bought a couple of hundred at a different price when he told me that, but c'est la vie. Another option, if that doesn't sound practical to you, go to your local craft supply store and get a bag of red beads or marbles or whatever, little rocks that you would use for decorating with vases or flower pots. You can use those too. It doesn't have to be exact. Just make sure it's red. That's all. Your players will take that leap of faith with you. Okay, so after checking out the basic overview of the setting, it's pretty obvious we're playing a post-apocalyptic game here. Yeah, I know, there are a number of different systems we could use to do that, but if you're a newer GM, this will probably draw in more interested players than some of the others, and I totally concede that it's because of the tie-in to the video games. Look, I'm going to take my gamers wherever I can get them, folks. So with all of that covered, let's get into what I like to call the nuts and bolts of the system. It's a 2d20 system, so that means that most of the major rolls, like attack and whatnot, use 2d20s at minimum. The rules specifically state you'll never roll more than 5 of them, so if you're using your own dice and not the ones specific to the game, you'll want to pull about 5 or 6 d20s from your dice bag. D6s are the damage dice for this game, and the book provides a chart on page 29 that you can use if you're not using the custom dice. Again, I bought a couple of sets because I wanted to get immersed into the system, but I also know some folks don't like to buy special dice for games. Like Alton Brown has said on Good Eats on more than one occasion, we don't like unitaskers. Well, when it comes to dice, I do, but I completely get it if you don't. So, to put this into the terms we'll be using throughout the season, let's set this up with an example, shall we? Let's do a skill test, and it's something your players are going to be doing frequently during this campaign. And I'll be using some of the players from my table as the example names, just so we're clear. I didn't ask them for permission, but sometimes it's better to beg forgiveness than ask for permission anyway. The group has come across a band of scavengers who just happen to have some parts that they need to get the robot they're trying to salvage working right. They really need these parts, and they haven't been able to find them anywhere else. So, Scott's going to try to barter with them for what they've got. For the record, Jim and Gabe typically try to play negotiator types, but I'm going to give Scott the spotlight on this one. Since Scott's negotiating, I would ask him to use his charisma plus his barter, since barter happens to be based on charisma. For our purposes, we'll say Scott has a 6 in charisma and a 3 in barter, so that gives him a total of 9. This means that his target number is 9, and he has to roll at least the difficulty level of d20s at or below 9 to succeed. Oh yeah, forgot to mention a minute ago, this is a roll under system, which means rolling equal to or under your target is a success, while rolling over it is a failure. I apologize for just now mentioning that. So, what's the difficulty of the roll? The GM determines that, and it falls between 1 and 5, since 5 is the largest number of d20s you can roll. In my opinion, these parts the scavengers have are very rare, which the group will know because they've been searching for them for days or weeks, and it's a good bet the scavengers know this, so they'll want to drive as hard a bargain as they can. That being said, while I want to challenge the group, I also don't want to set the difficulty so high that there's absolutely no chance of success. So, I think I'll split the difference between making it too easy and way too hard and set the difficulty at 3. That means Scott needs 3 successes for his negotiations to succeed. And for our purposes, Scott failing at the negotiation doesn't mean the group can't get the parts they need. It just means they'll have to pay the asking price rather than a lower price they'd like to pay. So it's not like this negotiation is life or death unless Scott rolls all 20s, but we'll discuss that in a minute. At this point, Scott needs to put together his dice pool. By default, he gets to roll 2 dice. That's the base for all skill check rolls. He can purchase more dice, but no more than 3 by spending action points. We'll talk about those a little later. Scott really wants this negotiation to go in the group's favor, so he's going to spend 2 action points and buy 2 dice. This means he's rolling 4 dice and needs 3 successes. Rolling the dice, he gets a 1, a 10, a 13, and a 3. Means he failed, right? Wrong. In Fallout, 1s are considered to be critical successes, and critical successes count as 2 successes. So, he's got 3 successes, and the negotiations succeed. That's an awful lot of use of the word succeed. I apologize for that. Had any of Scott's dice rolled a 20, there would have been a complication on the action, and again, we'll get into those in a minute. I'm kind of trying to do things in a certain order here. Also, if the skill being used is a tag skill, you get a critical success for any roll at or under that number. We'll say for the record that barter is a tag skill, so Scott technically got 4 successes. Way to go, Scott. Oh, one more thing to do before we give him the result. Every success above the difficulty number needed automatically becomes an action point. So, since Scott needed a 3 and got a 4, we reward the group an action point. Once that's done, I'd roleplay how the negotiation went from that point. Since he succeeded, the group would get the parts for the price they want to pay and can then get on with the rest of their mission and their day. Now, let's talk for a moment about complications. When a player rolls a 20 on a check, it means a complication has arisen. It doesn't prevent the character from succeeding on the roll so long as they've got enough successes to do so. What it does is bring something into the scenario or campaign that hadn't originally been there. Let's use our example to make this simpler. Had Scott rolled a 20, so long as he still had the 4 successes, he'd have succeeded at his task. However, I would have had the opportunity to insert something into the game that would be unexpected. Maybe Scott managed to handle his business, but insulted one of the scavengers to the point that the next time these two groups meet, the scavengers aren't going to want to deal with him, or they will refuse to deal with Scott at all. Alternately, it could be a situation where someone from a rival group happens to see the deal from a distance and decides the group has joined forces with the scavengers, making their dealings with other groups a little more difficult. In the case of combat, complications can be things like a gun that jams right after firing that shot that hits. You get the picture. The attempt can succeed, but it can bring something along that will make life a little more difficult in the long run. There's one more kind of skill test I wanted to mention here, and it's the difficulty 0 test. Now you might be asking yourself, what the heck's a difficulty 0 test? Well, it's a test that's so easy or simple, there's basically no way the character can fail the roll, which would mean they wouldn't have to roll dice. It would also mean there's no chance of a complication, so that would also be needed to take into account. We're talking about the very basic of tests here, the type of things that you as a GM would typically just give your players rather than make them roll for them. However, the player can choose to roll for successes on this. Now, why would they want to do this? Well, when no roll is made to succeed, there are also no action points rewarded. So if your players want the action points, they're going to have to roll. The downside to that is that if they roll, complications are brought back onto the table. Fortunately for them, they don't have to roll any successes, so all they're really doing is avoiding complications. For every success they do roll, they get an action point. So, that's why your players might decide to roll on a difficulty 0 test. Now, of course, you can always decide not to allow that, because your group might be the type that wants to roll for everything, thus bogging down the game in a rolling contest. It's your call, certainly wouldn't blame you for it either way. Another thing to understand about complications is that the GM has the ability to increase the possibility of one depending on the difficulty of the task at hand. So if the action is life-threatening, the GM could increase the range of a complication to 17 to 20 or even 16 to 20. Now this is a GM option rule that's spelled out in the book, page 17 if you're interested. You don't have to do this, but if you're one that likes to take some big stakes in your game, it's another tool that you can put in your GM's toolbox. Also, if someone on Scott's team wanted to try to help him in his negotiation, say Gabe for example, he could, especially if Scott wanted to roll more dice but the group didn't have any action points left. So Gabe would roll 1 d20. If he rolls under the target number, it's a success. It adds to the number of successes overall, but it doesn't impact the 5 dice limit for the primary player in this situation. Also, Gabe's die would be subject to criticals and consequences just like any other roll. Okay, so we've covered the task tests. There are 2 more I want to cover in this section, and the first is the opposed test. Now, the most obvious place you'd use this is in combat, especially in hand-to-hand combat. So Let's get into examples again to explain how these work. The group is being attacked by a group of mole rats. While this might not seem like a big deal to those who don't know Fallout, these little buggers can be deadly. So while the rest of the group seems to be dealing with theirs fairly easily, Jim's gun jammed, so he's stuck with having to deal with this one hand to hand. However, let's say Max finishes his off just as Jim and the mole rat are getting into it, and Max calls out that if Jim can hold him in place, he'll take care of it for him. So Jim's going to grapple with the mole rat. Not advisable typically, but we're doing this as an example, so just roll with it. There is no grapple skill in this game, so this is going to be strength plus either unarmed or athletics. I'd allow either one since one could argue either one would work. Since we're being nice GMs, we'll go with the one that's better for the player. Jim's strength is a 6 since he's playing a brute type, and he's got 2 in unarmed and 1 in athletics. So Jim would be pushing for using unarmed, so let's do that. That puts him at a target number of 8. Since this is an opposed check, rather than randomly selecting the difficulty, I'd roll 2d20 versus Jim's target number. I'd roll my dice and get a 1 and a 7. That's 3 successes. So Jim's difficulty will be a 3. Of course, he can buy dice with action points, but they don't have any action points. That's okay. I'm going to jump a bit ahead in my tour of the book here and point out that Jim could still buy himself a couple of more dice. The trade is that I get an action point for each die he buys. Now, Jim doesn't really want to do that, but he also knows that the mole rat gets loose. Somebody's probably going to get hurt. And the way his luck's been going today, it's going to probably be him. So he very reluctantly buys 2 dice to bring his pool to 4. He rolls a 3, a 5, an 11, and a 20, so we've got a fail plus a complication. Now, normally, this would be the final result, but I know Jim, and there's a rule that allows him to actually succeed on his task. Here's how it works. Jim would be allowed to succeed on holding back the mole rat. Now, he can't use action points to improve it, which is irrelevant in this case since he doesn't have any. The flip side of that is he'd have to take another complication to allow it. So in this case, he'd have 2 complications. This is a situation where I wouldn't know what to do for 1 complication, let alone 2. As a GM, you'd have this freedom to do pretty much whatever you'd want. Or there's another option. I can choose to let Jim off the complication hook for 2 action points for my side. I'd set it up as making a deal with him, and if he didn't accept, then we'd agree to come up with something later. The final test I wanted to cover here is the group test. What, might you ask, is a group test? Tell you what, let's use the example the writers use in the book, because to me, it's the one that makes the most sense at this point. Let's say the group has been split up for a job, and Aniston, Max, Clayton, and Tyler have to try to sneak past a group of super mutants that control the area they're in. There's 8 mutants, and the 4 of them, so we're setting the difficulty at 4. Now, this is an agility plus sneak roll. For the sake of argument, let's say Tyler has the best numbers with an agility of 5 and a sneak of 4, which gives us a 9. He will take the lead on the roll, which means he starts with 2d20 and gets the chance to buy more with action points. Each of the other 3 get to roll 1d20, and we'll explain what happens next in a moment. While Tyler feels pretty confident about the group's chances, knowing the average only needs to be 1 success per person, he's going to hedge his bet and buy 3 more dice. That means he's rolling 5d20. He rolls a 10, an 18, a 17, a 16, and a 2. So we got 1 success, and we probably hear some swearing from him at this point. Look, I got it. I've been there. Since he got a success, the other 3 can roll. Aniston gets a 1. Critical success, so 2 successes. Clayton gets a 10, and Max gets a 10. They needed 4 successes. They only got 3. So for me, there's only one outcome here. Somebody was too loud, and I'd rule it as both Clayton and Max since their rolls were equal. Needless to say, this sneak task has now become a combat encounter. My suggestion to you, run. Moving along, let's take a more detailed look at action points, since I've mentioned them a dozen times or more to this point. I've mentioned that action points can buy more d20s for rolls, but it's not a straight 1 point per die buy. The first one is 1 point, the second is 3, the third is 6. So in the example we just did, Tyler would have spent 10 action points to try to succeed, which makes that failure that much worse, which would explain the heavy swearing. You can do more than just buy dice with these action points, by the way. You can use a point to ask a single question of the GM about the current situation. However, the GM doesn't have to be specific no matter how specific your question is. The GM does have to be honest, though. So vague would be the way to go if you're not going to go just straight up give them answers. 2 points can be spent to speed up the amount of time it takes to complete a successful test. And by the way, these can be spent after the test is successful, which makes sense because you wouldn't want to spend them until you were certain you succeeded. Basically, the 2 points allows you to halve the amount of time the task takes. In combat, you can spend points to take additional minor actions, major actions, and add extra damage. And the number of points needed depends on the situation. Those are noted in the book, page 18. Now, I do need to point out that there are no rules in the book about being able to hold on to action points. My personal belief is that this is something that was missed when the writers put this together. And I have the errata for the game, and they haven't corrected it there. Now, I also need to note that as the GM, you have action points you can use as well. The rule states that at the start of each quest, you get 1 point for each character in the group. So for me, I've got 7 players. That means I get 7 action points to use at the beginning of each quest, plus whatever they give me by buying points along the way. These are definitely use or lose during the quest, since they reset at the beginning of the next quest. The last thing I want to hit on in this section, since it can also impact die and interactions, is luck. Luck is not only an attribute, but there are also luck points that can be used during the course of play. At the start of a quest, each player gets a number of luck points equal to their luck attribute. So if Clayton has a luck of 5, he starts each quest with 5 luck points. However, if Aniston had a luck of 1, he only gets 1 luck point at the start of each quest. By the way, that's not actually possible. Lowest score you can start with is a 3. I was just doing it as an example. There are 4 ways you can use luck in the game. Luck of the draw. That allows the player to spend a luck point and gain 1 helpful fact or detail about the present situation. Let's do an example. Max is out of 308 ammo, and he's the only one with a gun that uses it. So he's out scavenging for ammo. He's not having a lot of luck finding any, so he decides to spend a luck point. Now, as the GM, you could do this in a number of ways, up to and including actually having him find some 308 ammo, though if you do it this way, I'd have him find less than he would have if he thought of the best places to look for it and found some. There's a caveat to luck points, though. The GM can choose to not allow the use of luck points for the purpose the player wants to use them for. The prime example of this would be if they're trying to use luck to avoid a situation. In that case, no is a very appropriate response. As an alternative, you could also require spending more luck points to succeed if that's something you think luck points can be used on. Next up is what we've called the stacked deck. This is a pretty simple one. When doing a skill test, the player can spend a point of luck to use their luck attribute instead of the attribute the test calls for. Obviously, this is only a benefit if the luck score is higher than the other attribute, but it's an option if the player wants to use it. Lucky timing is also an option. This is another easy one to understand, and it's a combat-specific option. During a combat round, if the character hasn't already acted, the player can spend a luck point, interrupt the initiative order, and take their action for the round. To be clear, this is not an additional action. It's the character's action for the round, just at a different point from their initiative. Last up is misfortune. This is the way you basically make your own luck. What it means is this. For 1 luck point, the player can re-roll 1d20 or 3d6s. They can spend as many luck points as they want to re-roll dice, but the rules specifically state that each die can only be re-rolled once. So if you re-roll that 20 and get a 19, that die is done. Move on to the next. Now, I know I just said luck points reset at the start of every quest, but there's a way to get some luck back during a quest. If you have a personal trinket, which we'll cover later, 1 time per quest, you can take time outside of combat to look at your trinket, thinking about the memories tied to it. How long you need to do this is up to the GM, but I'd hope he'd give the players some say-so on this. Once you've done this, you regain 1 luck point. Alright, those are the basic rules for the game as laid out in Chapter 1 of the Fallout Rulebook. But you know me, we're not going to just stop with the basic rules. We have to discuss combat in more detail before I let this episode run out. Of course, we can't talk about combat without first addressing initiative. Initiative works different ways for different games and systems, and if you followed us through our Deadlands game last season, you saw a very different way to do initiative. A character's initiative score is determined at character creation for Fallout. It's perception plus ability. So unless those increase, there's only one other way to increase it, and that's with bonuses from equipment worn or perks utilized. For GMs running creatures, the initiative is figured by adding the body plus mind. For NPC characters, figure it the same as for PCs, though your big bad evil guy will probably have some modifiers. So when stuff's about to go down, here's how we figure out who goes when. Look at the initiative scores. The character, monster, or NPC with the highest score goes first, then go down the list in numerical order until everybody has gone. The rules specifically state that in the case of there being a tie, it's up to the GM to decide it. For me, here's how I do it. If it's a PC tied with a monster or NPC, PC goes first. If it's a tie between monsters or NPCs, pick one and go. If it's a tie between PCs, either make the call yourself or have them do a dice off. Since they're using D6s, have them each roll one and the higher roll goes first. Now, if you've got another way you'd like to try to do this, do it. I've seen rock, paper, scissors used to break ties before, so if that's your style, go with it. And if you're a Big Bang Theory fan, of course, you can use rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock. If you don't get that reference, Google it. Once we get initiative figured out, then we got to act. There are two types of actions a character can take, minor and major. Each character can take one minor and one major action during combat. The rules state that an additional minor action can be purchased for 1 action point, and an additional major action can be purchased for 2 action points. However, a single character cannot have more than 2 minor and 2 major actions in a given round. Minor actions allow the character to do things like aim their weapon, which allows them to re-roll 1d20 on the first attack roll they take in a round, draw an item that they're carrying, or pick one up off the ground. For the record, they can also put something away, as long as it goes on them somewhere. They can also interact with the environment in a basic way, like opening a door, pushing a button, and so on and so forth. Of course, they can move with a minor action. The rules state, though, that they can only move up to 1 zone, which keeps them within medium range, or if need be, they can move by getting up from prone. They can also use a minor action to take a chem, which can be healing or power boosting in this game. Now, the caveat here is that they need to have already pulled it out to be able to take it. Otherwise, they need to use a minor action to pull it out before they take it. There are a number of major actions you can take in combat, and they're detailed on page 26 of the Fallout book. Check them out there for a full explanation. I mean, come on, if I put everything on here, there'd be no need for you to buy the book. Plus, I'd put myself in a very actionable position with Modifius, and I really would rather not do that. I do want to specifically cover a few more items from this section in today's show, so let's just keep rolling along. I mentioned the initiative order a moment ago, and I noted there weren't many ways to change that score. However, there is a way a character can go earlier in the round. As I said, if they spend a luck point, they can immediately act, interrupting the initiative order and get their minor and major action. They can still use action points to buy additional actions, but all the usual limits apply. While I told you to read the book for information on combat itself, I did want to make a point about how lethal combat can really be. The weapons in this game can do a lot of damage, and if your characters don't have the chems they need for healing, or if they fail their first aid checks, they could potentially be in a world of hurt. I'd also note that critical hits are a distinct possibility, so keep that in mind as you make your way through the wasteland. We'll get into this more as we build, but I wanted to put the thought in your mind as we begin the process. Okay, so we could spend a lot more time going over the specifics of combat, but I think what we'll do is head for the Fallout gamebook and check it out. It's pretty well written and it lays things out in good detail. Plus, we're going to be covering bits of this as we need it as we build. But that being said, it's a really good idea as a GM to be familiar with the concepts, since your group probably won't do things the way we expect them to do. Or my group never does anyway. Anyway, I think that's a pretty good point to end today's show at. Next week, we're going to get into character creation. I'll go over the various types available and we'll discuss what I think might be the way to build a party. I can assure you, my group won't do it that way, and yours probably won't either. Don't forget to check out our other podcast, Roleplaying History. We've got a new episode up this week, deep diving another topic you didn't know you wanted to know about. Roleplaying History is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website at badgmproductions.ne. All Fallout role-playing game materials we reference on this program are the property of Modifius Entertainment through their license with Bethesda Studios, and we use them here for entertainment purposes only. The Fallout role-playing game is available right now at your local game shop or from the Modifius website, modifius.net. Let me spell that out, modipius.net. The The music we use for the show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Bad GM's campaign Build Along is a production of Bad GM Productions. Check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/gaming/badgmprod, on Twitter at badgmp, YouTube Bad GM Productions, Tumblr Bad GM Productions, email us badgmproductions@gmail.com, online our website badgmproductions.net. Next week we go into the character creation process so we can begin to build our starting area. And for those keeping score at home, we'll start building a campaign right about episode 4 of this season. But we'll get back into the process next week. Until then, I'm the Bad GM Wayne Davis, and I'll see you at the game table.